Good morning, everyone, and can I welcome you to the 8th meeting of 2020 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone to turn mobile phones and other devices to silent mode so they don't disrupt the meeting. Well, apologies this morning from Mark Griffin. Hopefully Mr Brown can join us later, but that's the apologies I have at the moment. We move to agenda item 1, which is decision to take an item in private. The committee is asked to take item 7, work programme discussion, that is taken in private. Is the committee agreed? Now move to agenda item 2, subordinate legislation. The committee will take evidence on the Carers Allowance Operating Scotland Order 2020 draft, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. Can I remind members that both affirmative instruments we'll be considering today were circulated to members on the 24th of February. Can I welcome, therefore, Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People, and her officials, Veronica Smith, Cross-Cutting Policy Officer, and Niall Wilson, Solicitor. Can I welcome all three of you here this morning? Thank you for joining us in what are quite challenging times for the work everyone has to dispose of. I can invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
It's a pleasure to be here to be able to carry on the business of government and Parliament and ask committee to consider the draft order and the 2 sets of regulations that are required to uprate the Carers Allowance, Young Carers Grant and Funeral Support Payment in April 2020. At the same time, I hope we can take this opportunity to make some small but important technical amendments to the Young Carers Grant and Funeral Expense Assistance regulations. As you know, last year we discussed at length the Scottish Government's approach to uprating devolved social security assistance. We considered the analytical report provided by my officials, which gave an in-depth analysis of the uprating measures available. In the subsequent discussions with the committee, I said that from the evidence provided, I believed the Consumer Price Index was the most appropriate measure for uprating for the next few years. The Scottish Commission on Social Security also shared that view. On the 7th of February, my officials laid the first Section 77 report in the Scottish Parliament, which sets out the impact of inflation on the devolved assistance and what we intend to do for the next financial year. That is that the Carers Allowance, the Young Carers Grant and the Funeral Support Payment are to be uprated by the September 2019 CPI of 1.7%. To bring this into effect, the Carers Allowance uprating order sitting before you now will increase the weekly rate of Carers Allowance from £66.15 to £67.25. The Carers Order also restates the amount of child dependency increase as an additional weekly payment for a small number of carers that are still eligible. The Carers Regulations being laid also increase the Carers Allowance earning threshold. This is increased from £123 to £128. There are also changes to the earning thresholds related to the child dependency increase I mentioned, and they are set out in the draft regulations. The Carers Allowance Supplement Statement within Section 77 report confirms that the supplement will be uprated by September CPI of 1.7% as well. For the first time, we will also be uprating the Young Carer Grant and the Funeral Support Payment through the powers under the Act. The Funeral Expense Assistance and Young Carer Grant uprating regulations will uprate the Young Carer Grant from £300 to £305.10. The lower flat rate element of the Funeral Support Payment, which applies when there is a funeral plan in place, will be uprated from £120 to £122.5, while the £20 for removal of an implanted medical device will increase to £20.35. I'm also delighted that I was able to not just uprate but also uplift the standard flat rate element of the funeral support payment from £700 to £1,000. That's an increase of over 40%. As I said at the start, through our uprating regulations, we've also taken the opportunity to make a few technical amendments. The technical amendments to the funeral expense assistance regulations will ensure that the lower flat rate payment of £122.5 is only applied in circumstances where the deceased has had a funeral plan in place and not funeral insurance. This amendment ensures that the original policy intention is met by only providing the lower flat rate where the deceased person has paid in advance towards the specific cost of a funeral, where the deceased person has merely taken out an insurance policy which may help meet these costs. The higher amount will be paid before deductions from the estate of the deceased is applied as normal. On this, SCOSS observed in its published report that the amendment to the treatment of funeral insurance to ensure applicants are not disadvantaged where it concerns people with lower incomplete insurance is a small but positive measure. We pressed the UK Government to agree that the young carers subject to immigration control should be eligible to receive our Young Carers Grant without risking their immigration status, and I'm very pleased to report that they've agreed to that request. I'm sure the committee will welcome this change through the amendment. This mirrors our success in measuring and ensuring that eligible young asylum seekers under the age of 18 were able to apply for the Best Start grant, pregnancy and baby payments. Happy to take questions, Convener.
Secretary, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is, when we went through this process last year, Cabinet Secretary, you pledged to consult with carers and carers organisations on the issue of the value of the payments made to them, and I just wondered if you had any update on that consultation.
So we will carry out the formal consultation to how we wish to make long-term changes as we move to the devolution of our carers package. Obviously, we have ongoing dialogues with carers organisations, and I am aware that they, of course, would like to see changes to the current carers allowance package, and would like to see those changes being implemented. So again, that's an ongoing dialogue that we have. I absolutely recognise that they would like to see changes in key areas, but again, the stress would be the fact that we are on a timetable within our wider social security packages, and because carers allowance will not be dealt with until after disability assistance, we have of course put in the carers allowance supplement.
Okay. I don't know if you will recall, but last year there was some discussion in this committee over CPI versus RPI, and you know, obviously there's a wider discussion here in general about the amount itself, which over 35 hours is markedly less than a living wage. But one thing I'd just like to probe a bit further for clarity. The information that we have for today's committee meeting explains that we are tied into doing what the UK government do by the agency agreement. So can I just ask why it was necessary for the agency agreement to stipulate that tie, that we are bound to do what the UK government are doing, and whether or not it's ever possible to renegotiate that agreement?
Well, the way the agency agreements are set up is that you carry on as what would be business as usual for the DWP. That is the basis on which the agency agreements are signed. Now, there could be negotiations around with the DWP around what changes you might want to see. The DWP are under no obligation to do that and to look at it, and it would obviously take a great deal of officials' time, both at Scottish Government and DWP level, to go through those negotiations to see whether they're even possible to be done, in which case we're actually taking time away from actually genuinely delivering the benefits rather than looking at the changes. So I absolutely appreciate that people want to see change. I appreciate that they want to see that change as quickly as possible. But I think there has to be a recognition that we are moving at pace with the Social Security programme, and the priority is to deliver that programme as quickly as possible. I would perhaps give some suggestions to the kind of practicalities about why it really wouldn't be something that the DWP would go for, and therefore again we would be wasting our time, is that in effect we would be asking the DWP to pay to we'd be asking the DWP to change their computer systems, to change their processes, to have a different way of working just for Scottish clients. We would of course have to pay the DWP for that. We would have to then wait for the DWP to be able to make the changes to the computer systems on the basis that they have an enormous workload programme themselves, not just within the devolution of benefits. So you see the kind of practical arrangements that even if the DWP were willing to do it, the time lag in doing that, the fact that it would take people off delivering it, would suggest to me that the priority, as we are doing at the moment, remains on delivering the programme as quickly as possible, rather than both asking the DWP to put in sections of work that we would have to pay for and they would have to find time to do, and to be fair to them, a very busy schedule that they already have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy Balfour, MSP.
Thank you, Convener. I appreciate everything is very busy, but I do think it's important to put on record, particularly how grateful I am for the work you've done around funeral expenses. I think both from families that I've spoken to and also funeral undertakers. We really appreciate these regulations and the changes that I've made, and I think it will bring a lot of benefit to some very vulnerable people in our society. So with all that's going on, I think we can miss these things, but I just want to say that I think these are really positive and have certainly our party's full support on the direction that you're going around funeral expenses. And again, I think I've said before, but I think it's good to put on record that the feedback from funeral directors I have as the convener for cross-party group on this is that the system is working really well and that they are finding it a very easy process. So again, just sometimes we're all very negative at committee, but for once let me be positive and say that I think this is working really well, and thank both the government and particularly the officials for the work we've done around this.
I see the Cabinet Secretary nodding her head in relation to that. I would point out that I know we're looking at those matters again, Mr Balfour, at agenda item 4, but that's on the record now, and that's very, very positive. Are there any other questions on agenda item 2? Okay, there being no other questions at agenda item 2, we now move to agenda item 3, where I'm going to ask Ms Somerville to formally move the motion S5M 21020 on Carers Allowance Operating Scotland Order 2020. Could you formally move that, please, Cabinet
Moved, Convener.
Secretary? Are there, I mean, very artificial in relation to it. You can have a debate on this should you wish. Are there any comments at this stage anyone wishes to have? Okay. So we therefore the question is is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We move to agenda item 4, still subordinate legislation. The committee will now take evidence on funeral expenses, assistance and young carers grant operating miscellaneous amendment Scotland Regulations 2020, also in draft form, which is also subject to affirmative procedure here this morning. And can I again invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an open statement before we move to questions?
An opening statement, Convener.
Okay, that's helpful, Cabinet Secretary. Put on record the supportive comments that Mr Balfour's already made in relation to this, and that was very welcome. Are there any questions from anyone at this stage? Okay, there being no questions. Yeah, well, there's agenda item 5. Okay, I'm just checking I'm following my brief properly here. So we'll now move to agenda item 5, which is where you now formally move that particular motion. So could you please formally move motion S5M 21019 in relation to funeral expenses assistance and young carers grant operating miscellaneous amendment Scotland Regulations 2020. Could you move that, please?
Glad you had to say that, Convener. Moved.
I see Mr Simpson, who I think's chaired the subordinate legislation over the years in here. We'll have had to do far more than that. Thank you for formally moving that. Is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument? Thank you very much. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and your officials? Just before we move to agenda item 6, can I maybe just put on record, I think on behalf of the committee, that given the coronavirus pandemic that all of government is having to tackle right now, our gratitude to government and your officials for doing all you can to build resilience into not just the social security system but wider society. We know we've got our part to play as a committee, but we will be having to look at potentially look at legislation, because it won't be business as normal. Business must still be disposed of in this place in relation to making sure matters such as the Scottish Child Payment is on track and delivered in December. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of all of the committee if I say you have our best wishes, and we'll do what it takes to keep business functioning as normal as best as possible. But thank you to yourself and your officials for coming along here this morning.
Just on that point, Convener, can I thank you very much for those words. They are appreciated at this busy time. I do intend to update Parliament and thereby the committee on the implications of coronavirus on the social security programme in due course. So that will be coming soon, because obviously this will have implications for all of government, and that includes social security. Okay,
we fully appreciate that, and thanks for putting that on record here this morning. So thank you to you and your officials. We will now suspend briefly before we move to agenda item 6. Thank you. Welcome back. And we now move to agenda item 6, still subordinate legislation. And the committee is invited to consider 3 negative instruments, and we will take each instrument in turn. Can I ask that is the Carers Allowance Operating Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulation 2020 SSI 2020/32. And I'm just following my brief here. Can I refer members to paper 3? The main purpose of these regulations is to increase the amount an eligible person for carers allowance can earn in a given week without being considered to be gainfully employed and therefore not entitled to receive carers allowance. The threshold amount will increase from £123 to £128. Is the committee content to note this instrument? Okay, thank you. And we now move to the Council Tax Reduction Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020 SSI 2020/25 and the Council Tax Reduction Scotland Amendment number 2 Regulations 2020 SSI 2020/64. Can I now refer members to paper 4? These instruments operate certain allowances and premiums in the principal regulations in line with the equivalent changes made by the DWP to housing benefit. They also reflect changes made by the DWP to ensure people who move from certain social security benefits to employment and support allowance continue to receive a transitional allowance beyond April 2020. So that's what these regulations do. Is the committee content to note these instruments? Okay. Thank you very much. And as agreed at agenda item 1, we now move to our final agenda item 7, the work programme, which we've agreed to take in private. So we now move into private session.